So in this chapter, we are going to take up the semicolons on the SAT. We are going to look through rules 1 and 2 of the 3 rules that we are going to do for the purpose of our SAT. So let's start with semicolon rule number 1. As we have told many a times that semicolons are only used to connect independent clauses with another independent clause. So basically a semicolon will be joining an independent clause with an independent clause. One might argue that the most common punctuation between two independent clauses is a stop or a period. Yes, it is. But what happens if the independent clause is sometimes closely related to the second independent clause? In that case, we generally use a semicolon, never a comma, because if we use a comma, then it becomes a comma splice error. So we use a semicolon always between two independent clauses. So it is very important for us on the SAT to find out whether the LHS of the left hand side of the semicolon and the RHS of the semicolon both are independent clause or not. So let's take some examples. I do not like to eat chocolate, full stop. Ice cream is my food of choice. So it can be written as I do not like to eat chocolate. Ice cream is my food of choice. Very important that this I should not be capitalized as in the case of a full stop. So it is very, very simple that two independent clauses can be joined together using a semicolon. Generally, more often than not, when these two independent clauses are closely related to each other, a semicolon is used. But that is not the point of contention when we look at SAT. The most important part that we need to understand when we look at SAT questions is the LHS and right hand side check whether both of them are independent clause or not. So let's take this example. The green zebra tomato ripens without turning red. It's difficult to know when one is ready to eat. We've used a comma. Both of them are independent clauses and hence a comma creates a comma splice error. So the correct answer to this one, if it is one of the choices which says semicolon, then it has got to be a semicolon. So let's look at some examples. I'll solve some examples. Rest you can pause the video and it is for your discretion. So let's take this one. Brad did, Jake did not. So Brad did, definitely independent clause. Jake did not, makes complete sense. There is a semicolon to demarcate that. Yes, it is correct, right? These things, these three you can work out. Alicia doesn't understand. She has never been through this before. She has never been through this before. Independent clause. Alicia doesn't understand. Independent clause with a semicolon, definitely correct. The cow didn't produce the most milk. This is definitely an independent clause. She made the best milk, independent clause, but then because there is a but, which is our fanboy conjunction, as you can understand, fanboy's conjunction, and there is a semicolon before the fanboy's conjunction. Hereby the fanboy conjunction has turned this into a dependent clause. So this is definitely incorrect. The rest, you can pause the video and do it for yourself. I'll leave it to your discretion. But then these are the answers to the rest of the stuff. So now let's nosedive into semicolon rule number 2. We will call this tip 14. I am not basically harping on the tips right now. We will have a different video on all the tips when we summarize our journey through the SAT. So we are not harping too much on the tips right now. Semicolon rule number 2. So semicolon rule number 2 says that whenever two independent clauses are connected with a transitional word, they are linked with in meaning with a transitional word. So what is a transitional word? One that shows the relationship between these two independent clauses. So it could be additive transitional clauses, words. It could be contradictory transitional clauses, like words like however. Mr. X is a good singer, however, he couldn't win the competition, right? So, however, basically shows the transition between independent clause 1 and independent clause 2, wherein it is contradictory. Though he was a good singer, he couldn't win, right? It could be additive, it could be cause and effect. So, it could be examples. These are all transitional words, right? So, whenever we have a transitional word between two independent clauses, then more often than not, very important, between two independent clauses. We are not talking about transitional words between an independent and a dependent clause. Whenever we have got transitional words between independent clauses, I, then a transitional word, and then another I, we have to put a semicolon, as is the rule between two independent clauses. We have to put a semicolon, and generally there is a comma after the transitional word. More often than not, these transitional words are the adverbs, right? As we have already seen that there is a list of adverbs called the conjunctive, or the words that add, conjunctive adverbs. We have done that when we have done our chapters on adverbs. Most of these words would use this kind of a rule, wherein you have got an independent clause and then a semicolon, then the transitional adverb or the conjunctive adverb, and then you will have a comma, and then you will have an independent clause to follow. So, let us take some examples. These are most common adverbs that are conjunctive adverbs. So, let us take some examples. I need to go for a walk and get some fresh air. Perfect. Independent clause. I needed to buy milk, independent clause. So, there is a semicolon and there is a comma. You can do, or you can look through the rest of the examples. So, these are all examples that are in the same category. So, caution, the highlighted portions, both these have to be an independent clause, else we have to use a comma. Else we would pair this transitional word with this one, and we will only use a comma out here, provided that these are not independent clauses, this one. But then we have to be sure that both of these are independent clauses. This one, however, is an atypical example that SAT asks you. During the English neoclassical period 1660 to 1789, many writers imitated the epic poetry and the satires of ancient Greece and Rome. They were not the first in England to adopt the literary modes of classical what dash. Some of the most prominent figures of earlier Renaissance period were also influenced by ancient Greek and Roman literature. So now the question is whether it is antiquity and however with a comma, antiquity and however with commas on both sides of however, antiquity comma however and then a semicolon, and antiquity semicolon and then a comma. So obviously by our rule, let us first check the left hand side and the right hand side of the statements, whether they are independent or dependent clause. So during the English neoclassical period 1660 to 1789, many writers imitated the epic poetry and satires of ancient Greek and Rome. That's obviously an independent clause with a full stop. So we don't need to actually come back to this question, this part of the question. Now let's look at this one. They are not in they were not the first in England to adopt literary modes of classical antiquity. That's definitely an independent clause. Some of the most prominent figures of earlier Renaissance period were also influenced by ancient Greek and Roman literature. So also an independent clause. So if we look at the LHS and the RHS check for this one, we have got independent clauses on both sides. So it's basically independent and independent, and we have got a however, which is nothing but an adjectival conjunction. So logically, by the rule that we have just understood or just highlighted, the answer should have been antiquity and then a semicolon and then a comma. So logically the correct answer should be D. But in this one, as we have already said that this is an atypical example on the SAT, the answer is not a D. However, the answer should be a C, not a D. Why is it so? Let's understand that. So obviously, the comma and the comma, we can always rule out A and B, because definitely you cannot have an independent clause, comma independent clause, which results in a comma splice error. So definitely A and B are ruled out. The only options that you stand with is a C and a D naturally, but D looks to be the most logical by the immediate rule that we have just completed. But in this one, if you actually see, they were not the first in England to adopt the literary modes of classical antiquity. Now, this, however, should be the transition between this statement and the statement that follows. Some of the most prominent figures in earlier Renaissance period were also influenced by ancient Greek and Romans. But then this transition doesn't make any sense. However, as a transition between these two statements doesn't make a sense, because these are not contradictory in nature. So, this however has to be included with the antiquity. Antiquity, however. So, that is the logic behind this kind of a statement. We will have to see whether this however actually makes a sense in transiting between this sentence A and sentence B. If not, then we have to consider this however along with the antiquity. The first sentence then simply reads, they were not the first in England to adopt literary modes of classical antiquity, however. Let's do some examples. When he returned from the Galapagos Islands in 1835, Charles Darwin brought back a young tortoise named Harriet. She would live over 170 years before passing away at the Australia Zoo in 2006. So let's do the LHS and the RHS check. Before he returned from the Galapagos Island in 1835, Charles Darwin brought back a young tortoise named Harriet. Definitely an independent clause. We can put a full stop out here. She would live over 170 years before passing away at the Australian Zoo. Definitely an independent clause. Cannot be a comma out here, because this creates a comma splice error, and hence the most logical one that we can do is B, because there is a comma which is incorrect, no punctuation, definitely incorrect, and semicolon, okay, sorry, it cannot be B, because there is a who out here. We are not changing this word, so it has got to be a D, not a B, right? The answer should be a because there is a who and there is a she. I didn't notice that in the answer choices. Be very careful, because we see a semicolon and we jump onto the answer, and it might be wrong because they have changed this kind of a word. So the correct answer should be a D. So let's do the next example. A work of great scholarship by Icelandic law speaker Snorri Sturluson, the Prose Edda, was written in the 13th century and offers a compelling introduction to the Norse mythology. So let's, for convenience sake, call this SS. A work of great scholarship offered by Icelandic law speaker Snorri Sturluson, yes, or SS, is definitely an independent clause, is definitely an independent clause. The Prose Edda was written in the 13th century and blah blah blah. So this is definitely an independent clause. Both of them are independent clauses. So the only options that we have is either a full stop or a semicolon. So let's look at those two examples. I'm quite sure that B is incorrect, quite sure that C is incorrect. So either this one, that is a semicolon, or this one, which is a full stop. We have got a comma after the, which is an article, right? So we never have a comma after the article. I'm quite sure about that. B is incorrect, and the only answer that we are left with is an A. So A is the correct answer for this question. So this is how your SAT rules for semicolons would work. We have to do an LHS and an RHS check. If both of them are independent clauses, then we rule out the possibility of a comma. Once we rule out the possibility of a comma, we have to only look at semicolons, colons, or full stops. Full stops basically are very difficult to find on the SAT. So either semicolons or colons could be the correct options. So stay tuned for semicolon rule number 3, which is going to be the serial, like the serial comma or the Oxford comma, we have got the serial semicolon rule. So stay tuned.